Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Momjian, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce our speaker today. I had the pleasure of meeting Geoffrey Robertson in London at the Wiener Library for Holocaust and Genocide Studies during the centennial of the Armenian Genocide. There was an exhibit by Dr. Armen Marsoobian, and I got to meet a living hero, someone who has done so much for the promotion of human rights throughout the world. And it's a privilege for me to give you some background on this extraordinary individual. Geoffrey Robertson is a founding head of Doty Street Chambers. He has had a distinguished career as a trial and appellate counsel, an international judge, and author of leading textbooks. He has argued many landmark cases in the media dealing with constitutional and criminal law, and in the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, the Supreme Court House of Lords and Privy Council, the UN War Crimes Court, the World Bank's International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and in the highest courts of many Commonwealth countries. Mr. Robertson has, as a jury advocate, appeared in many criminal trials at the Old Bailey, libel trials in the High Court. He has appeared in several hundred reported cases in the Court of Appeal, both in the civil and criminal divisions, and in judicial reviews in the High Court and in subsequent appeals. He has a large advisory practice for clients, including governments, media corporation, NGOs, and local councils. At Columbia University School of Social Work, will you please welcome Geoffrey Robertson?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's a pleasure to address you, albeit on a somewhat melancholy occasion, as we consider the snuffing out of democracy in Nagorno-Karabakh. I visited the country several times some years ago to prepare a report on whether it was entitled to independence, whether it was entitled to self-determination, to what we call remedial secession. I spoke to all its judges, to its lawyers, to its politicians, and I had no doubt that it satisfied the conditions. It was a democracy with fair elections, with free speech, with an independent judiciary, and it was such for almost 30 years until the Azerbaijani aggression which overturned it. So I want to begin by explaining why it was entitled to independence at the time it was invaded. Nagorno has been Armenian for many centuries. Just look at the Christian churches in the mountains. Look at most particularly, the Russian census after it annexed the country in 1805. They did a very exhaustive census in 1825 and found that over 90% of the people were Armenians. And that was the case in 1920 when Lenin wrongfully allocated it to Azerbaijan rather than Armenia, allegedly at the prompting of Ataturk, who wanted to keep Armenia weak. 1923, Stalin made the same mistake, making it an oblast with considerable autonomy within Azerbaijan. Of course, the Azeris transplanted some of their people over the next 50 years, but by the time the USSR broke up in 1990, 75% were Armenian. And their parliament decided initially to amalgamate with Armenia. It's a pity they didn't go ahead with that idea. But as the fighting with Azerbaijan developed, and the Karabakh army, made up mainly of their own people, with generals who had fought for Russia over the years, they decided to go it alone. And they decided to become Nagorno Karabakh. There was, of course, some provocation. There was a war that developed after the pogroms in Sumgait and Baku, a full-blooded war. And in that war, there were terrible war crimes committed during the siege of Stepanakert, when the Azeri bombing and guns from Sushi rained down on school playgrounds, on churches. I interviewed a number of the survivors, and it's quite clear that that was a terrible war crime. Guernica writ small. And it was part of that war which the Karabakh forces eventually won. They used some old Russian tanks and climbed up the hill to Sushi and took away that position. But during the war, there was a humanitarian corridor. Several thousand people in Stepanakert were killed, and there was an attempt to starve them into submission. But the Lacan corridor that was the key to their survival, and it is ironic, isn't it, that that was used as the pretext for the Azeri assault this year. But they won the war in 1994 and have developed their democracy ever since for almost 30 years. They were never recognized, and this is an anomaly that needs explanation. In 1994, in an attempt to bring the war to an end, the United Nations Security Council passed a number of resolutions about it, and in those resolutions, it described Nagorno-Karabakh as part of the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan. This was never argued, it was never the subject of any decision. It was really inserted in those resolutions to butter up these areas, to encourage them to accept a ceasefire. But nonetheless, it remained, and it was the popular conception. Even the BBC during the last few months has been calling Nagorno-Karabakh secessionists. Well, they're not separatists, rather. They're not separatists. They are part of their own land. So it has been since 1916 a matter of international law that a country is entitled to remedial secession, is entitled to leave the oppressive rule of another country and become independent. That was the case, you remember, with East Timor. It was the case in Kosovo. Both those countries were recognized. Unfortunately, the case for Nagorno-Karabakh as a separate entity was never put. And so it was never recognized, although it had embassies in a number of countries. And so you get, I think my report went nowhere. Well, it went to the governments of both Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, but I'm told that it didn't suit Russia for any claim to be made on behalf of the independent Nagorno-Karabakh. But there is no doubt in my mind that it was entitled to independence. It was described in a book by de Waal, who was the leading authority, who pointed out that the Armenians were significantly different from the Armenians of Armenia. The Karabakh Armenians are highlanders, famous for their hospitality and heavy drinking. They have a highlander's distrust of lowland Armenians, other Armenians, and so on, listing the differences and ending up saying the difference is rather like Scotland and England, the Highlanders being different. And I concluded this. Today, there are many cultural distinctions between the two peoples of a kind that mark countries where people of the same ethnicity have developed in different ways. An example of national holidays, for example, shows many differences in the events and ideas that each country commemorates. They now have many different laws and distinct court systems. They make stereotyping jokes about each other. Karabakh humor depicts Armenians as money grabbing, while Armenians joke about the mulish stubbornness of Karabakians. Armenians drink coffee, Karabakians drink tea. Karabakians have as their national drink, which they consume excessively, a highly alcoholic mulberry liqueur, which repels Armenians. Karabakh is a world famous for its unique carpets, which are not made in Armenia, and its cultural monuments, evincing many centuries of unique spiritual life, the subject of many books. The modern-day Karabakians are custodians of a remarkable and unique cultural heritage, which is a source of national pride. The flag, whilst in Armenian colors, has its unique carpet symbol superimposed, not dissimilar to the flags of so many former countries in the British Empire that have the Union Jack in the corner. The Nagorno-Karabakh coat of arms is very different to the Armenian one. It features a carpet motif and depicts the outstretched wings of an eagle soaring in the Karabakh mountains, along with a representation of a famous Stepanakert statue of parents and grandparents, symbolizing historical continuity. Well, all that has now been wiped out since the surrender, understandable surrender to greater Azerbaijani force after its aggression in September. And so what changed everything, I think, has been the situation in Ukraine, because it was because of the Armenian absolutely correct and principled support for Ukraine that Russia pulled the carpet out of its support. It had been directed by the Security Council to preserve the peace, and it was like directing a fox to take care of the henhouse. It decided that Armenia would be punished. So that is, if you like, the case for Armenian. But I want to talk about the consequence of this in terms of the failure of the rule of law to protect democracy. The war in Ukraine is essentially a fight for democracy, a fight for the Ukrainian right to govern themselves. And they had the free press, the fair elections, and the independent judiciary that are the indicia of democracy. Well, what has happened? It must be remembered that there is no protection at all for democracy in international law. The United Nations Charter doesn't mention it. It does say, as the first rule, that it must protect, it must suppress aggression. That's in Article 1, to save the world from the scourge of war. That's what its preamble says. But absolutely nothing about democracy. And of course, it fails to protect states from aggression. And by a fortiori, it fails to protect democratic states from aggression. That's because of the way the United Nations was constructed, with the General Assembly as pretty much a talking shop, and the Security Council having all the power. But the 5 permanent members of the Security Council can veto any resolution that the others try to pass. That's why Russia has vetoed every resolution calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine, and only the other day, America vetoed the resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. It is simply impossible in these circumstances to protect a democracy under attack. There was indeed no effort made by the Security Council in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh. There was no effort made in the Council of Europe, of which both Armenia and Azerbaijan are members. Not a squeak out of the council when Nagorno-Karabakh was invaded. I was last week at a meeting about democracy that the Council of Europe held, and I couldn't resist pointing to its hypocrisy in holding a meeting on democracy when it had failed to say anything about its loss in Nagorno-Karabakh. There is a concern, of course, that Armenia may suffer an invasion by Azerbaijan backed by Turkey. Well, who would care? What would where would international support come? You've been in the palm of Russia for so long, there aren't all that many staunch supporters. I'm sure some would come, but it's not an easy matter. Russia has been the albatross around Armenia's neck ever since Stalin made the allocation of Nagorno-Karabakh to Russia. So there is, if you like, the wider question. It's asked about the United Nations' failure to do anything about the invasion of Ukraine, which was a flourishing democracy, and it can be asked also in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh. We live in a world where 94 countries, at last count, of the United Nations were not democracies. They were monarchies, tyrannies, or religious or military dictatorships, or run by sheikhs. And you can't expect the United Nations to have anything to say about democracy. And in international law, where there is the possibility of tilting it in favor of democracies. There was one case a few years ago in Fiji, where an international court, after a coup, had overthrown a democratic government, decided that there was, in fact, they found a presumption in favor of democracy. If it had been overthrown, there had to be proof that the population supported the new military junta or whatever. So that's the only case where there has been, in that situation, the suggestion of a presumption in favor of democracy. But that is something for democratic countries to consider. The United Nations is worthless as a protection. Do we need another organization? That was a quite active discussion back in 1938 with the collapse of the League of Nations, and at a time when Stalin and Hitler were in bed together working out how to carve up Poland. And there were a lot of ideas. The English visionary H.G. Wells wrote a book suggesting that there should be an organization of parliamentary peoples, he said, to replace the League of Nations. It didn't come to that, of course, by Yalta. When the United Nations was being put together, Stalin was a staunch ally and even was able to have parts of the USSR, including Ukraine, accepted as a full member. So it's too late to save a United Nations that cannot save democracy. But it may be that the organization of the kind suggested in 1938, which would not have members from authoritarian or totalitarian countries, which would be one of democracy powered by the intellectual, political, and economic force of uniting in their favor, would be able to better protect. I'm not suggesting a military alliance, although it might come to that, but I think it will be necessary once the embers of Ukraine are over to construct something like that. And I hope Armenia will be part of the support. There are organizations already, the 35 countries that adopt Magnitsky laws to banish human rights perpetrators, the countries that have signed up to the International Criminal Court, 124, most of them are democracies, the countries that are currently meeting as a core group to plan an aggression tribunal to put Putin on trial. There are these collections of democratic countries, and it may be that as a result of Ukraine, as a result of Nagorno-Karabakh, there can be born an organization to safeguard democracy. But that, at the moment, is in the distant future. What is present at the moment are the pain, the suffering, the expropriation that have occurred in Nagorno-Karabakh as a result of unlawful Azeri aggression. Now, can that be in any way contested? Well, there are courts where it can be, and I think there are a number of prisoners of war who have been subject to farcical trials in Baku, charged with genocide, which is a ridiculous, improper charge. They can certainly be appealed to the UN group on arbitrary detention, because their detention is arbitrary and their trials are grossly unfair. So that is one thing that should be attended to as soon as possible, and probably is, I'm not sure. There are cases that can be brought by Armenia at the European Court of Human Rights on the basis of unlawful aggression, which has forced many Armenians out of their home and earth. They've lost their possessions and so forth. That is another venue that is possible. Also, the International Committee, Human Rights, can be approached in terms of the aggression of Azerbaijan and the loss and the right, indeed, of Nagorno-Karabakh to be treated as an independent state. It may be that the International Court of Justice, which is currently hearing a battle between Ukraine and Russia over the genocide question, can be activated through the Genocide Convention. But these are all questions that will no doubt involve Armenian lawyers in the near future. For the present, we must lament the loss of a unique culture, and we must resolve to have it remembered in the battle to make the world safe for democracy, while at the same time pursuing such legal actions in international courts as are available. Thank you.
I'm going to do it from this mic because I'm not sure this one works.
I can turn it off.
That's okay. We have time for a few questions for Mr. Robertson. Chris, do you want to lead us off? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
It's on?
Chris?
I don't think it's on.
Yes.
I don't think it's on.
Attorney Robertson, my name is Chris Parnagian. I'm a lawyer here in New York City. Thank you for your trenchant analysis. Thank you for your righteousness. In my opinion, the worldwide Armenian community owes you a debt of gratitude. I did the best I could to read the English translation of the Soviet Constitution in respect of how republics and oblasts could secede and become independent. There's a number of Armenian scholars that say that under the Soviet Constitution, Karabakh did have a right to vote and declare its independence. Do you agree with that under the Soviet Constitution?
Yes, I do, because Ukraine mentioned that and did indeed do that back in 1990. It is quite interesting, the parliamentary history, but by agreement with Russia, it decided and did, by popular vote, become independent. So I don't see why Karabakh could be disallowed that right.
Time for a couple more questions? Sure.
Do you know that the Center for Truth and Justice did a well-documented thing about Azeri violation of Armenian human rights and took it to the International Court of Justice, who ruled that in Armenia's favor, yes, Azerbaijan was doing these war crimes, and they should end the blockade. But there is no enforcement of the International Court of Justice. And also, I just want to say one more thing, that it was England in like 1918 that they wanted the Baku oil, and they helped, Azerbaijan with thugs kill 20,000 Armenians and threaten unless you, kill everybody unless you agree to become part of Azerbaijan. And it is England that's still doing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. Frankly, the worst case was the Safarov case. You remember the Azeri soldier who hacked off the head of a Nagorno-Karabakh soldier in a NATO camp, jailed for life, and then 7 million euros were said to have been paid to various people in Hungary, where he was jailed, and he was returned to Baku. He got all his back pay. He was given a promotion he became a national hero. I mean, it's that kind of hate-filled story which is backed by oil wealth. And indeed, Azerbaijan was accused seriously of corrupting members of the European Parliament a few years ago. So that is one of the problems. The ICJ decision I'm well aware of, but of course, as you say, the ICJ has no army. And the sad thing about that decision, it was a very good one, but and usually enforceability comes because member states of the ICJ take it up and back it and run with it. But no one did for Nagorno-Karabakh.
Thank you. We have, of course, many Columbia alumni here. This is an opportunity for a Columbia student, an undergraduate or graduate student, to ask one of our world's leading human rights scholars a question. I invite a student who's currently at Columbia to raise their hand and get this great opportunity. I know, I'm looking for a student who's brave enough to ask a question. No? Well, that's extraordinary. That's a first. All right, I surprised everyone. Please ask your question.
Thanks. Do I need to turn on the mic?
Yes, please.
Three questions, two maybe easy and one hard. Interesting to hear the comments regarding the Soviet Constitution and secession and so forth. How do you compare Crimea's secession from Ukraine relative to Artsakh secession from Azerbaijan or other examples? Because, of course, that is the argument that is made to justify that secession with a vote, given the population, 90+% who identify as Russians. Second, what do you think it will be the impact of Armenia's accession to the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court? Will that provide some measure of protection for further acts of aggression by Azerbaijan into Armenia proper? And finally, and this is going to be the hardest question, I think, the conclusion I've sort of come to in the last 24 hours, observing Israel's deliberate targeting of journalists, deliberate targeting of medical workers, refusal to recognize a distinction between civilians and combatants, absolute siege and blockade of electricity, food, water of the population in Gaza, supported by a democracy, the United States, armed by a democracy in the United States. Does international humanitarian law have any relevance? The courts cannot enforce their orders. The ICJ has no power. The UN Security Council.
Thank you. We have to let the speaker answer. This is what we call the trifecta in the United States. Mr. Robertson, did you hear those questions, and could you kindly respond?
I did. I don't think they're difficult. The answers may be difficult, but it's not difficult to give them. The first, well, nothing succeeds like secession. Once you've got it, you can keep it, but unless it was a bogus secession, as was Crimea's in 2014. The little green men came out from the Russian naval base at Sevastopol, and of course there was a referendum in which 95% or something of the populace was said to support Russia. But you've got to beware of referenda which have those sort of figures. By and large, it's regarded as a rigged referendum, as can be seen from the fighting in Crimea as part of the war. That is not, in fact, the case. So I don't see the so-called Crimean secession, which was in fact an annexation by Russia as being of much help to anyone. The second question you asked was in relation, well, I can't remember the second question. What was it in relation?
Armenia's accession to the Rome Statute.
Oh, yes, yes, at last. Thank goodness, at last. It came, didn't it, last month?
It did.
Yeah. Well, it was not before time. And I don't know whether the war crimes committed by the Azeris in 2002 or indeed in 2020 or indeed in 2023 can be taken into account, because that would be said to be retrospective prosecution. But I think it will provide some protection in the event of an Azerbaijani-Turkish attack on Armenia, because it will arouse and involve the other member states, who include Britain and France, and in protection. So it will help even at least in bringing in those countries to get themselves involved.
Okay. Did you get the third question dealing with the analogy
Yes, I
to what's
did.
okay?
I did. I got it well. We've just had a protest march in London of 500,000 people asking for a ceasefire and asserting Palestinian rights. And yes, there are war crimes on both sides. The horrific October the 7th attack by Hamas, the taking of hostages, which is a very serious war crime. And I think the crimes committed by Israel in terms of starving the population, in terms of bombing without, quite recklessly, without, and a number of attacks on hospitals and refugee camps. I mean, the refugee camp case is important for philosophers as well as judges, because one Hamas terrorist is killed and 50 innocent refugees were killed in that bombing. Is that justified? I think the difference between Hamas war crimes and Israeli war crimes is that Israel at least has a defense, if it can be made out, but their killings must be proportionate. If Hamas would release the hostages, then of course, if Israel continued its actions, it would be disproportionate. The argument, of course, is how will they ever be brought to justice? My colleague, Karim Khan, the prosecutor, is currently, I think, in Rafah at the border. He's not being allowed in. He's got his hands full with his indictment of Putin, but now he's ventured to at least the border of Gaza and promised to prosecute. He will have, I suppose, suspects will be the leaders of Hamas who gave the orders and the leaders of Israel who approved the bombing. Whether they will ever be brought to his prison near The Hague, I don't know. The Hamas leaders may be. Israeli cabinet ministers who go on holidays to Europe may find themselves arrested in a country which has universal jurisdiction. And so they might be asked to account for war crimes. But international justice works very slowly. The Karadzic and Mladic kept hidden for 17 years. there was some fellow, the main funder of the Rwandan genocide, who was picked up in Paris after 20 years in hiding. So, you know, it's a catch as catch.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. We want to extend our deep appreciation to you for your keynote, and we want to continue to applaud your efforts to promote human rights throughout the world. Thank you again.
Thank you.
That's right.
Yep. Yeah, here it is. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
We want to move quickly to our next panel to keep on schedule. Two of our panelists are here in person. One of them, Peter Balakian, will be joining us remotely today. We will move along with the schedule we have in the program, barring any unforeseen electronic glitches. My name is Armen Marsoobian. I'm a member of the board of the Armenian Center who has organized this. I must say I didn't play as big a role as our local organizers, both Nicole and unfortunately Husik Muradian, who because of illness has not been able to be here, but I'm sure he's listening. He has been a real force for supporting Armenian studies here at Columbia. We will begin, as other moderators have done, since the program already lists the bios. I will not repeat what's in the program, but I would like to introduce our first speaker with a couple of words. Rachel Goshgarian. She is Associate Professor of History at Lafayette College and is acting head of the History Department there. She also has had an association here with Columbia. She served on the Armenian Center Board, where I was happy to work with her a number of years ago. And one of the areas, of course, that she's worked on will be presented here today. She, I know, has traveled with Peter Balakian to Ani, and if any of you were at the lecture last night, you got a beautiful presentation on that famous Armenian city. What this panel is about today is cultural heritage at risk here in the Artsakh conflict. One of the areas that Rachel has been working on, along with others who have been, as you will hear in our last panelist, with Caucasus Heritage Watch and other organizations, trying to get the word out about what has been lost and what is at risk. And we all know what has been destroyed in the past in Nakhichevan, also in Armenian lands in the Republic of Turkey. And with that, I will turn it over to Rachel.
Can everyone hear me? Is that good? Okay, thank you very much, Armen, and thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you especially to the Armenian Center, to Nicole, and to Mark and Husik for organizing. I'm very honored to be on this panel today with Peter and also with Husik, who's working now with Caucasus Heritage Watch, a major effort through Cornell and Purdue universities. So I won't talk too much about their work because I look forward to learning with you from Husik himself. Okay, so I've prepared a written text because otherwise I'll talk for an hour and a half. Does this work? Seems not to.
You want me to see if it...
It was working before. Oh. Oh, there. Let's see if now it will. Yeah. The Armenian cemetery of Jura or Julfa in Nakhichevan, with its medieval khachkars, 2,000 were still extant in the 1980s, was intentionally destroyed by the Republic of Azerbaijan in 2006. Simon Balakian undertook important research and writing on this topic for the online arts magazine Hyperallergic, alerting the world to this tragedy of erasure. A more recent article by Avedis Bedros Hadjian, also in Hyperallergic, shares that 98%, and here you see, these are some of earlier images. These are actual images of men in the Azeri army destroying the khachkars of the cemetery. And here you have the image from just over the border in Iran. These should be familiar to many people here, but we share them again to commemorate and acknowledge. A more recent article by Avedis Bedros Hadjian, also in Hyperallergic, shares that 98% of Armenian cultural heritage in Nakhichevan, a region inhabited by Armenians since the 2nd century BCE, has been destroyed. This analysis is largely based on a newly released report by Caucasus Heritage Watch, which identified 108 medieval and early modern Armenian monasteries, churches, and cemeteries in Nakhichevan that were completely destroyed between 1997 and 2011, a, quote, striking portrait of cultural erasure that in its surgical precision, totality, and surreptitiousness has few parallels, unquote. As Christina Maranci has explained, we know well what happened in Julfa in Nakhichevan. We know what happened to the Church of the Mother of God in Jibrail, Surpas Vadzadzin, destroyed completely. You see the before image on top, the after on the bottom in 2020. We know what happened in the village of Medz Tarer or Büyük Tarlar, Both were completely scrubbed from the landscape. This is imagery, again, from Caucasus Heritage Watch, using earth-moving equipment like bulldozers. And we know what happened in Razan-Chetsot, the cathedral in Shushi, which was shelled, vandalized with graffiti, and quote-unquote restored without its Armenian steeple, cupola, and now is being rebranded not as an Armenian site, but as a quote-unquote Christian temple. Since Azerbaijan's September military offensive, the 13th century monasteries of Dadivank in Kelbajar and Ganzasar in the Artsakh province, both of which are really amazing examples of 13th century Armenian architecture, have already been rebranded as always this term ancient, inappropriately used, ancient Caucasian Albanian temples. As for the countless Armenian inscriptions on these buildings, khachkars, and tombstones, President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, announced in February that February 2021, so after the Second Karabakh War, that these are Armenian forgeries and eventually will be restored to their original appearance. Following the let's go back for 1 second. Following the First Karabakh War, the monastery of Ganzasar was renovated and refurbished through the funding of Russia-based businessman and philanthropist Levon Hayrapetyan. Restoration took place between 2000 to 2002, and they restored the altar, the gavit, and the floor tiling. It remained obviously under Armenian control after the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020. In 2020, Armenian activists called for international monitoring of vulnerable sites in Nagorno-Karabakh by UNESCO and other heritage organizations. This is an important document that was prepared by the Armenian Bar Association, asking for protection of Armenian sites in Artsakh and beyond, and nothing happened. In October 2023, early October, a video posted online showed Azerbaijani police inside the monastery. Around the same time, Azerbaijan's State Service of Cultural Heritage issued a statement in which they said that Ganjasar Monastery is, quote, one of the most prominent monuments of Christian architecture of Caucasian Albania, and it had been vandalized while under Armenian occupation. Our Azerbaijani historian Rizvan Huseynov claimed that the Armenian inscriptions had been falsified. Armenian archaeologist and sort of the champion of the movement to protect Armenian heritage in Artsakh, Hamlet Petrosyan, and the organization Monument Watch responded to these false claims. On October 9th, Armenia's representative to UNESCO, Christian Dersepanyan, noted in his speech that Azerbaijan attempts to appropriate and distort the identity of Ganzasar, one of the most famous medieval Armenian monasteries. So I guess some of the questions I want to ask today are the following. What does it mean to try to preserve Armenian cultural heritage in lands where Armenians have been intentionally displaced and or killed? What does it mean to try to preserve Armenian cultural heritage in lands where the history of Armenians having lived in that place is intentionally erased and or falsified by the government of said place? How much space is there for actions on the part of non-state individuals, community organizations, and non-governmental organizations? Or sort of echoing Sarah Lee Whitson's recent question, is international law even effective anymore? What is the point of preserving Armenian architecture in, quote, hostile lands? Will Armenian structures be used for historical study, for worship? Is there any way in which we can imagine a preservation and a transformation of certain sites such that they might be preserved, recognized as Armenian, and used rather than destroyed? How might that work, and what might that look like? I'm going to look to the only other example that I know well And this is not to say that the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Republic of Turkey are the same country. It does not do us, we do ourselves a disservice when we imagine that they are. But let's look at the Republic of Turkey for a minute. The eastern part of the current territory of the Republic of Turkey obviously is part of the ancestral homeland of Armenians. Both during and after the Armenian Genocide, Armenian cultural heritage was targeted for destruction by the Ottoman state and later by the government of the Republic of Turkey. Of the several thousand churches and monasteries, according to Raymond Kevorkian's work, around 4,000 structures, in the Ottoman Empire in 1914, today only a few hundred are still standing in some form within the borders of Turkey. Most of them are in danger of collapse. Those that continue to function are mainly in Istanbul. Many of the properties formerly belonging to Armenians were confiscated by the Turkish government and turned into military posts, hospitals, schools, and prisons. Others were given away to individuals. The legal justification was a specific law, envali metruke, the law of abandoned properties. Still, many Armenian structures in the Republic of Turkey were destroyed intentionally and over time by various arms of the government and or the military. The discourse on Armenian cultural heritage in Turkey, is primarily focused on the structures themselves, right? And seems to take place between various arms of the government of the Republic of Turkey with occasional input from the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul. More recently, these conversations have expanded to include the World Monuments Fund and other non-state actors such as Anadolu Kültür, the NGO championed by Osman Kavala, Free Osman Kavala, that have been engaged in trying to preserve some of the Armenian architectural heritage in the Republic of Turkey and have broadened the conversation to include specialists in Armenian architecture from the Republic of Armenia and the world. The recent restorations of certain sites, namely here the Church of the Holy Cross at Akhtamar, completed in 2006. Oh, sorry. Here we have the Surp in Diyarbakir, completed in 2012, also known as Beshhoran. And then Surp Yerortutun, I guess I lost that, Surp Yerortutun or Uchhoran in Malatya, which was most recently refurbished. Those have been very publicized events that take place in cities and that have, given an opportunity for the government of the Republic of Turkey to suggest that Turkey is a diverse and welcoming of difference. But the situation is far more complex and uneven than these few visible acts of preservation might lead one to believe. This is in part because actually there are so many Armenian structures all over Turkey, and also because while some of them were constructed in city centers, the bulk of Armenian architecture is actually off the beaten path, right, in places near villages. So the sites in major cities have a more knowable modern history of either conversion to mosques, intentional destruction, or most rarely, preservation and commemoration. It's more difficult to assess what has happened to the vast majority of Armenian cultural heritage sites built in more rural areas. On top of this, one actually has to take into consideration the experiences of more rural, less visible populations in Turkey who live with old Armenian structures, and to understand that their experiences could be quite different to those of city dwellers. Thus, the situation of Armenian cultural heritage kind of has to be considered in Turkey within a set of circumstances defined in many respects by urban-rural differences and the poignant and significant class, cultural, and experiential diversities of people living in the Republic of Turkey. I want to talk for a minute. Oh, there's Surp Yerortutun. Do you also notice what the diversity of Armenian architecture in Turkey, right? Maybe you wouldn't look at this and immediately say, wow, that's an Armenian church. But it is an Armenian church constructed in Malatya in the 17th century. I want to talk for a minute about one site, Husik, which, you will often see images, right? So this is the before. These are images taken in the early 20th century, also known as Beş kilise, meaning 5 churches. This is like just 25 kilometers from Kars, or from Ani, actually. And then, here it is today. While we know that it was intentionally destroyed, and recently Patrick Donabedian has written a very illuminating article explaining the different theories about how it was destroyed, but there is a general consensus, both amongst village dwellers in the region and academics, that it was bombed intentionally by Turkish military in the 1950s, right? So in the 1950s, like 40 years after the Armenian genocide, right? They go into this middle of nowhere. It takes like an hour to walk there from the village. Not a village, kasaba, from a town near there. And still they bombed it out in the 1950s. I just want to, okay. So this site was built in the 11th and 12th centuries by the Bagratids at the same time as the various monasteries of Marmashen, which some of you may be familiar with, Sanahin and Haghpat, all located today within the borders of the Republic of Armenia. These rural structures, as you can see here at Husik, these rural structures have been praised for their architectural creativity, as well as for the aesthetic harmony that exists between them and their surrounding natural environments. What's left of Husik sits in a gorge 5 kilometers to the west of the town of Digor. The images, as I mentioned, are some of the most poignant of the destruction of Armenian cultural heritage, and we know that it was intentionally destroyed. But, and I'll end soon, here's an image by Marti Rosarian, who had visited the region and is famous, for his sketches. This is something he called like the pilgrimage. He didn't title it Husik, but it's obviously Husik. It imagines a lively pilgrimage there. In 2013, can you see these guys up there on top of Surp Sarkis? So in 2013, on a visit to Husik, I watched 2 shepherds. They had been taking their sheep, through the gorge. I watched 2 shepherds walking their herd, calling to their animals and singing, their voices echoing throughout the valley. One of the shepherds ran ahead and entered the semi-demolished Surp Sarkis and climbed up its interior walls and onto its roof. His partner joined him. They knew the structure like the back of their hands. As they maneuvered up through the crevices of the medieval church with relative ease and a certain familiarity. Later that day, my working group from WMF, World Monuments Fund, and Anadolu Kültür went for lunch in downtown Digor, that's the town near there. A banner hanging on a wall in the restaurant displayed an image of the half-destroyed church of Surp Sarkis, and it read Digor Kültür Platformu, or Digor Cultural Platform. The group was established in 2012 and still exists today. It offers cultural programming, creates links between Kurdish and Turkish populations in the region, lets people know about illnesses, death, blood drives, and the like. While the mission of this group might be conventional, the fact that the Digor Cultural Platform uses the image of destroyed Surp Sarkis not only on a banner, but also as its logo on its Facebook and Instagram pages suggests that the structure means something to people in Digor today. In the case of the complex of Husik, since the local community uses the image of the destroyed Surp Sarkis, it seems possible that the structure might have had a local extra Armenian use and appreciation, perhaps within and or beyond the framework of religious worship. It's with these kinds of questions in mind that I think we should start rethinking the ways in which we imagine cultural heritage preservation. And this might only work in the Republic of Turkey today, and maybe only because it's 100 years after the Armenian genocide, and maybe it still would encounter a range of complications, and maybe the Armenian church wouldn't even like it anyway. But it's the one thing that I can offer as a possible solution. With regard to the cultural destruction and falsification of histories of Armenian monuments in the Republic of Azerbaijan, For now, the best things that thinking people who care about this situation can do are, one, learn more about what is happening through the various online resources available, and there are a lot, actually. Here's just a list of some of them. Donate your time or money to organizations and scholarly efforts that are attempting to document both the histories of these sites and places, as well as their destruction and transformation. And probably most importantly, build coalitions with other people and groups whose cultural heritage has been destroyed or is at risk of being destroyed. Armenian culture has never existed in a vacuum of Armenianness. To imagine that it does today would be a detriment to the cause of preservation of such a fascinating and multifaceted cultural heritage and history. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving quickly to our online participant, Peter Balakian, who unfortunately couldn't join us because of a health issue. For many in this room, Peter does not need an introduction, but he is the Constance, the Donald and Constance Rebar Professor of Humanities and Professor of English at Colgate University. He also serves on the Armenian Center Board. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, essayist, memorist, and I will turn it over to Peter in, yes, there he is.
Thanks.
Peter.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Everything good? Okay.
Yep.
Thanks a lot, Armen and Rachel. I'm sorry not to be there with all of you, but some things intervened. Let me say, boy, Rachel, I have to say that really those images just brought back enormous nostalgia de la boue for me, being with you in May of 2014 and walking through the marshes to the 5 churches, or to the one remaining, and profound, really life-changing experience for me. Thank you again. In the reflections, let me say this. Husik asked me to give a paper on cultural destruction based on a paper I gave in 2020 after the first Azerbaijan-Artsakh war. And Nicole asked me to speak about this moment in a personal way and tie a few things together, as she put it. And it seemed, after I mulled this over, that I felt more in Nicole's zone, and I'm you know, I would not be able to augment Rachel's marvelous presentation now, and my interest in the Hague protocols of the post-war period and their relationship to cultural preservation continue to fascinate me, but they're really issues for the international lawyers and scholars in the room today to deliberate on more than I can. So I'm going to do this kind of reflection, and I want to start by, and so Nicole, I'm blaming you for doing what I'm doing today. The ideas expressed by Tallene Kachumian and Martha Bregan this morning struck me as vital to so many of us in our sense of psychological, social, and cultural reality. And I'd like to kind of riff more on it. What I had written this week seemed to overlap in some ways with a number of things said in the morning panel. So here I go. I want to note that Irvin Staub's term, a continuum of destruction, which he applies to events of mass violence, genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass killing, to conceptualize the historical flow of violence, I also find useful in adapting to what I'll call the continuum of trauma, when a particular culture group or ethnic group or religious group is experiencing generation after generation of what Martha Bragan referred to as being stuck in a state of perpetual crisis when the perpetrator continues to inflict violence on the culture by refusing ever to acknowledge and be accountable for the crimes. It really is a toxic condition. It's what I might call the no justice syndrome. For me, I can say I've learned a lot about life and art from African American history and from my African American friends and writers. And similarly, from Native American history and my Native American friends and writers. I often return to those histories and some of those texts in times like these when I, like I'm sure all of you, feel pressed about how to cope and deal with what's happened in the past 3 years. I come back to that phrase from the genocide scholars community that the denial of genocide is the final stage of genocide because it seeks to demonize the victims and rehabilitate the perpetrators. And denial attempts to create, as Robert Lifton notes, a counterfeit reality for the murdered community and its legacy. And this is why it's important continually to be vigilant and to counter lies, propaganda, and the denial all the time in all the places. In the US now, we have, serious denial culture encroaching on mainstream politics. Armenians can be real leaders at this moment in that zone as well. But I find the redressing the denialism through education and intellectual work and work in the various arts discourses to be morally grounding is good for the soul. For example, in another moment, when the New York Times gave 3 front pages during April of 2015, the centennial of the Armenian Genocide, it was good for the soul. It was a redress to Turkish denial, and it was an affirmation of the work so many had done in the scholarly and intellectual communities for decades. So I come to think that being an engaged Armenian in the diaspora, which is the only place I can speak from, and only really from my own zone and the communities I inhabit, of course, but being engaged is complex and layered, and it remains a perpetual struggle. And struggle is kind of the word that I've been mulling over these past weeks. Struggle. It's good, and sometimes it's debilitating. It's powerful, meaning-making, and sometimes crushing. Camus wrote about struggle in the myth of Sisyphus, and he used the Greek legend of Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill only to have it fall back down and force him to push it back up again as a punishment for eternity. This is not the motto I embrace for the Armenian community, but it's a small piece of a larger discourse. And it was a trope that Camus used to create a much larger philosophical terrain about struggle, justice, and the meaning of existence. If you know those 2 books of the 1950s of Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel, they're useful books for us all the time. Another idea of struggle that is always alive, I think, is embodied in the work of Martin Luther King. His movement faced extraordinary odds, but the movement broke down the wall of apartheid in America, the original American sin, along with Native American genocide. We can learn a lot from King's movement and of the virtues of struggle. Even if the arc doesn't always bend toward justice, the struggle for justice and for truth is necessary. Armenians have their own context. We're small in numbers, and our indigenous lands, at least historically, are large. And I'm including here, Anatolia. We have wanted over the past century to have an independent state on as much of our land as possible. And it's just instructive to think about this. I realize this is a gone past, but the land award to Armenia after World War I, after the Armenian Genocide, was given by the Allies at the Paris Peace Treaty and confirmed by President Wilson in 1920. And that map of Armenia was significant. It included a coastline on the Black Sea, a decent part of the Armenian highlands, as well as the south part of the Southwest Caucasus. And it was awarded with a sense of justice after the genocide. And this was a time when Armenia was in the press almost daily. Between 1915 and about 1923, Herbert Hoover once noted that Armenia was as familiar to the American school child as the word Britain. Well, that map, as we know, didn't work out. Those lands were grabbed back by the Ottoman army, and the great powers weren't there to support the land award. Armenians fought valiantly at Sardarabad in 1918 and fended off the Ottoman army, and Armenia held on to what is today the Republic. In the period of Soviet Armenia and Caucasus consolidation, Armenia lost more of its indigenous territory when Stalin partitioned, and that's the word I want to return to, Armenian Karabakh in 1923 from the mainland of the Republic. Karabakh was 94% Armenian in population in 1923. It was an indigenous historic province. And after the genocide, the partition of Karabakh was a shock, another shock and wound. The history of the next 100 years, I don't need to reiterate. But I'd like to say something in this moment as well about the language of public discourse and journalism to keep the thread going from the important ideas from Susan, Henry, and Artem this morning. What I found so painfully missing from the media coverage of the past 3 years, at least 3 years, and really past 30 years, was context and concept. Now, this is often the case with the media, which lives in the surface moment and not in complexity. We know that. It's not just an undermining of Armenian history. It happens in a lot of zones in coverage. And it's always connected to discourses of power. We know that. Now, as for context, for me, the major context in this story is the concept of partition. The 1923 partition of Karabakh from Armenia. Partition, like the British partition of Northern Ireland, or Ulster, Artsakh, right? Same concept. Ulster from the Republic, same year, 1923. There's a lot to be done with that. And the concept most missing, in my view, is a more expansive notion of national self-determination. And here we need to make concrete comparisons. Eritrea, South Sudan, Bangladesh, and dozens more, states that rose out of self-determination and were accorded identity by the global community. Why didn't that happen in the Karabakh case? Lots to say about that, and some of it's been said this morning. And of course, the issue of power, which always plays out in complicated ways in all sorts of public discourses. Now, I was thinking too, Henry brought up Samantha Power this morning and in a not so positive light. I don't want to go into this now, but I did have a positive experience with Samantha when the two of us went to meet with the New York Times executive editor in March of 2004 on the issue of changing the policy on the coverage of the Armenian genocide. And a lot to say about that. This isn't the place for it, but it brings me back into the arena of the complexity of journalistic discourse in relation to concept and context. More on that later. Coming back to struggle, the idea of struggle, we're all in it. We all keep working in all ways that we can. I mean, just the work, just Rachel and Christina and the cultural preservation operation, Lori Kachadorian, that all of you are engaged in is extraordinarily important. And it should be funded to the hilt. We all work as individuals and we work as parts of organizational communities we belong to. We're stronger together. We have lots of affluent professional communities around the world. In my view, never has Armenia as a social, cultural, and economic entity worldwide been stronger. I think that's clear. Just on a recent kind of moment that passed through my life last week at the co-op board meeting, Garo Armen, who's done an amazing job founding the organization, reported that the EU has given Armenia, in a way, co-op, 10 million euros for the building of 2 high-tech smart centers in the Sihanouk region. So that's good news. We need to plant lots of things in southern Armenia now with the possibility of Azerbaijan invasion. And we need Europe to take an interest in Armenia. We need the EU to take an interest. I think we're all compelled and challenged to reach the wider world. As many of you have, Scout, your work has been amazing in this sense about the state of Armenia and its various contexts, from Turkish genocide to Soviet partition to the de-Armenization of Nakhichevan and Artsakh by the unrepentant Turkish states. Cultural destruction in the Caucasus now is a crucial issue to figure out. Rachel, your questions echo loudly. We all need to keep telling Armenian stories. And I mean, of course, non-fictional stories as well as stories in the other genres. How many ancient cultures as old as Armenia have nations on the map today? So I want to hold on to the idea that struggle is confirming and humanizing, even if challenging and painful. How to think about our situation is part of the struggle, and how to mobilize the struggle is the other half of it. Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, quote, "That is why I am on the side of the struggle." The epic lends itself to this. Hitherto, the greatness of a conqueror was geographical. It was measured by the extent of the conquered territories. There is reason why the word has changed in meaning and has ceased to signify the victorious general. Thanks, and we'll talk more.
Thank you. We will move on to our next speaker before opening it up to the audience. With us today is Husik Ghulyan, who is a visiting scholar at Cornell Institute of Archaeology and Material Sciences. He's worked with one of the leading organizations in terms of cultural heritage protection. This is the organization that Rachel had mentioned earlier, Caucasus Heritage Watch. Laura Kachadorian and Adam Smith along with partners at Purdue, have been involved in this project using the latest technology to identify crimes against humanity and cultural destruction. So I will turn this over to Husik in a moment as he's getting ready. And you have the full biography here. I think we're ready to begin. We had a little technical problem, which I think hasn't fully been overcome, so bear with our speaker, who's now going to not speak from notes, but from his own vast knowledge.
Thank you, Armen, for that kind introduction, and I would like to thank Nicole and Husik for invitation and making all arrangements that made my visit possible here. I'm going today to share with you the work, our collaborative and collective work on a project called Caucasus Heritage Watch, or CHW. In late 2020, during the new war in Karabakh, Professor Lori Khachaturian and Professor Adam Smith at Cornell University and Professor Ian Lindsay at Purdue University launched a research initiative called Caucasus Heritage Watch. CHW is a program No. Okay, thank you. CHW is a program in heritage forensics, an approach to cultural heritage that operates at the intersection of archaeology, law, politics, and culture aerospace. In this approach, heritage is constituted by corpuses of materials and practices from the past that are resurrected and curated in the present. Forensics refers to investigations that document disruption of the legacy by state and non-state actors. In our forensic approach, our primary tool is satellite image, as you see on the screen. Our research uses this tool to detect, document, and deter attacks on tangible heritage to help reveal and combat the racism, ethnic hatred, and state violence that drive such attacks on cultural heritage. Our research, CHW is thus profoundly political and ethical intervention. We seek to understand the forces that drive abuses of heritage, the nature of their impacts, and the possibilities that new tools, like satellite imageries, these new tools of sensing and sense-making, offer for intervening in the programs of culture erasure. In the aftermath of the near total erasure of Armenian heritage in Nakhchivan region of Azerbaijan between 1997 and 2011, and the results of 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, it was clear that Armenian heritage sites within the transferred territories were at risk, threatened by the same policy of zero tolerance for Armenian historic remains. Here you see as black dots approximately 270 major historic sites that went under the control of Azerbaijan after 2020 war. Considering the scale of the issue, it was apparent that there was urgent need to have satellite monitoring program. To frame it in another word, aside from fancy academic notions like forensic heritage and trying to conceptualize and to look into the issue academically, this project also has urgent, pragmatic, this is pragmatically and urgent kind of attempt to try to deter actual erasure of cultural heritage. The recent ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, Karabakhi Armenians, why I'm mentioning this because there was a lot of rounds of ethnic cleansing in Karabakh, including ethnic cleansing of Azerbaijanis. Since we are talking about trauma, we should also acknowledge the trauma of other side. And considering the exodus of Armenian population of Karabakh, this puts a lot of pressure on our monitoring work because our monitoring work initially was focused on heritage that went under the control of Azerbaijan, mostly in the territories which Armenians ethnically cleansed Azerbaijanis, and then somehow it turned out that now Armenians faced ethnic cleansing and changing territories and like cultural heritage changing hands. So I will talk a bit later about how we are responding as a part of as our team and project is responding to the ethnic cleansing. I would like to talk a bit about our recent work about heritage in the region. In addition to ongoing monitoring program, we conducted two special investigations. In the first one, titled Silent Erasure, we document, which you see on the left, we document the complete erasure of Armenian heritage in Nakhchivan region of Azerbaijan. In the second special investigation, titled Between the Wars, we document that despite there wasn't a state-sponsored erasure program by Armenian authorities in Karabakh, this is very important. But at the same time, Nagorno-Karabakh authorities, Armenian authorities failed to protect Azerbaijani heritage in the region. For more about these reports and investigation, as well as our other reports, please have a look at our website. Since 2021, we have conducted a sustained program. Here I'm starting to talk about our regular ongoing monitoring program. Since 2021, we have conducted a sustained program of monitoring, tasking Planet Labs SkySat constellation to provide us with satellite images several times a year in order to maintain regular surveillance of approximately 270 sites. Those colored dots in the purple rectangles are the sites that we are currently monitoring. And we just recently ended our 8th monitoring program, so we soon would come with new observations in connection with what is happening, what happened recently in the region. Since 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, in total we have documented the destruction of 8 sites, damage to 9 sites, and 22 sites face imminent threat. Here it's important to mention the notion of imminent threat, because every heritage site basically is threatened in Karabakh right now. I mean the Armenian heritage. That is why CHW exists. But imminent threat is important in order to understand, since every heritage site is threatened there, but there are more sites that are much more threatened, you know? So it's important to highlight the degree of threat that heritage sites face there. By the way, in our website, you can see an interactive dashboard, including maps and graphs that are constantly, instantly updated when we do some updates in our database. And here you see some of the destruction cases. I think you mentioned the case of destruction of Metztavlar or Büyüktavlar, a village in Hadrut or Khojaven district. And here you see consecutive snapshots of satellites showing the complete destruction of large Armenian cemetery in that village. Here you see another case, the destruction of Sarnakh cemetery. Again, historic Armenian cemetery. Over the last 2 years, the most typical threat that emerged in connection with Armenian heritage was the gradual approach of bulldozer to historic Armenian sites. Here you see the case when roadwork was conducted in very close proximity in villages of Madagis and Arakhish, threatening 18th and 19th century Armenian church. We have released 22 alerts through social media and in our reports, including alerts about threatened 19th century church in Tagavard village in Hadrut or Khojaven district. We prioritize our visible presentation, visibility of our work in multiple fora, not only on the internet, news media, university, but also public domains where critique, accountability, and debate take place. Last April, for example, co-founder of CHW, Professor Khachaturian, discussed our work at a panel at the United Nations titled Prevention of Atrocity Crimes in the Digital Era. But we are intently focused on courtroom. The International Court of Justice, or ICJ, has recently taken a larger role in the case of heritage destruction. In 2021, after the second Nagorno-Karabakh war, 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, Armenia brought case again in this court against Azerbaijan, arguing that any destruction of Armenian heritage sites in Nagorno-Karabakh region constitutes a violation of Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And Armenia submitted CHW's reports as evidence in this case, calling for provisional measures to protect the Armenian sites. In December 2020, the International Court of Justice ordered Azerbaijan to take all necessary measures to protect Armenian places of worship and heritage sites. This was a significant development because it makes the World Court a new tool for heritage protection and preservation. Following the recent ethnic cleansing of Karabakh Armenians, Armenia requested the court indicate additional measures in respect to recent military offensive and ethnic cleansing, one of which was that Azerbaijan shall not alter or destroy any monument commemorating the Armenian genocide or any other Armenian monument. CHW will continue to closely follow this case and generate findings that are very relevant to the case. However, ICG's authority, the court's authority to secure heritage protection has yet to be tested. During our monitoring program last year, 7 months after ICG's ruling, provisional order to protect Armenian heritage in Azerbaijan, CHW documented a new destruction event, the first to directly challenge the court ruling. We uncovered the demolition of 18th century or 19th century church in Mokhrenes or Susanlık village in Hadrut, Khojaven district. The case before ICJ has yet to be decided on its merits, but it seems very interesting how the court is going to respond to the violation of its order. In connection with the destruction of this church, there is very interesting development because after the destruction in our recent monitoring round, we realized that the church is still there, but it's not there in the former imagery like during last monitoring round. So we have suspicions of something is taking place on the ground. We have no idea what is happening. Either Azerbaijan is trying to restore it because it's on Azerbaijan official heritage list as well, without any name, just as a temple. So we don't know what is taking place. We will see how, because it also, like, since Armenia requested provisional measures recently after the ethnic cleansing, Armenia provided our report as a proof that Azerbaijan violated the court order. So we don't know whether actually some kind of perjury is taking place on the ground, trying to imitate that actually the church is there, or actually Azerbaijan honestly trying to reconstruct the building despite like Albanian kind of. We don't know much about this. The problem with this project is we can do a lot of things, sense a lot of things on the ground thanks to satellite imagery, but there are limits which we call limits of thresholds of detectability, so we don't have much idea. So let's wait and see how the court is going to respond to this event. Finally, okay. As a result of Azerbaijan's total military capture of Karabakh last month, we estimate that the number of sites, major sites, requiring monitoring will increase from 270 to roughly 450. This number can change because we are still working with our database. This is a significant and costly expansion because we also should identify the priorities, what we are going to monitor. You have like Ganzasar, important heritage site, also large cemeteries, but you also have very small sites there, which are standing in the middle of nowhere, and it's very expensive purchasing satellite imagery to monitor. So you're also trying to figure out what is the best option to capture the entire sites in order to monitor, to try to deter their destruction. So this is a very significant and costly expansion. Since the spring of this, but what I would like also to mention that since the spring of this year, we were preparing for this kind of scenario because we were expecting that any change actually is going somehow to jeopardize the integrity of Armenian heritage there. So we prepared our database when the ethnic cleansing started, the military operation, anti-terrorist, which turned into ethnic cleansing. We already had a database so that we would start monitor the newly threatened sites. Here you see, outside of these blue, purple rectangular structures, the other sites that just went under the control of Azerbaijan after the recent ethnic cleansing. So we are going to focus on this, on these new sites as well. Here, I think this map reflects better the expansion of the scope of our work, because previously we were focused only on black dots, and now we need to expand our monitoring to cover also the yellow dots, which just in September, in last month, went under the control of Azerbaijan. And we expect our monitoring, the expanded monitoring, to start in the spring next year, but it might start very soon as well, depending on funding. The role of our heritage forensics amidst ongoing already accomplished ethnic cleansing and suffering of the Armenian refugees is to document heritage, witness abuses, and work to deter the extension of ethnic cleansing into the erasure of irreplaceable landscapes. Finally, I would like to thank our funders, without whom our costly rocket science, it's not a joke. Our project somehow resembles to rocket science in terms of its precision and the tools we use. So for sponsoring this rocket science, I would like to thank Armenian General Benevolent Union, Cornell University College of Art and Sciences, Aragats Foundation, Ford Foundation, Purdue University, and University of Southern California Institute of Armenian Studies. And thank you everyone for coming this event on Saturday. When we present our work in other places, other platforms, and when we talk with other people about our project, the most frequent question people ask what we can do for a project. And people to mention the importance of funding. And this is really expensive project in time, because it's not like you pay $25 and get image from Shutterstock. It's like expensive. It costs like grants to get just one satellite imagery to capture just one monastery. So we are in need of funding. That is why I kindly ask you, just spread the word. So Cornell University Alumni Association has showcased our project as one of the projects that needs that was open for crowdfunding. So it's open. You can just spread the word or just donate, whichever is option for you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, if you put it back up and use the top thing so the QR code is.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, while we're doing that, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Okay, I see one individual there. And you can direct it to individuals. Peter, are you back on? Yes.
Yeah, can you
Okay.
see me?
Yep, we see you. Okay. All right, please go ahead with your question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Very informative and important work. First, I had a question for Professors Ghulyan and Goshgarian. I'm curious, historically, if we have evidence of effective deterrent strategies for countering threats of cultural erasure, and is there a role for international on-the-ground monitors, be that the UN or the Russians that are trying to justify their continued presence in the region, or whoever else? And then a question for Peter, tying back to our second panel of today. I'm curious what lines of argument were convincing to the New York Times board when trying to persuade them to kind of care about Armenia-related issues, change their stance on the genocide. Thank you.
When you say historically, how far back do you mean?
As far back as you want to go.
We have lots of, frankly, Armenians probably won't like this, but, so many pre-Christian monuments were destroyed by early Armenian Christians, and this is well documented in the 7th century geography of Ananya Shirakatsi, and also in the map kind of version of this by Eremia Çelebi Kumurjan from the 17th century. And I guess what you could say is that authors writing about this in an Armenian context, like the way that they preserve the memory of these things was by drawing images of them and writing about their histories, which I would like to imagine something that we're kind of doing also, right? We're part of that tradition. In the context of more modern histories of intentional destruction of Armenian heritage by non-Armenians, we have a couple examples, where in the Republic of Turkey, I mentioned a few of them where there have been, intentional rehabilitations and then commemorations. Diyarbakır's church, the church in Malatya had its first Badarak a few months ago, or in the spring of last year. There are several, at Ani with the World Monuments Fund, and as I mentioned, Anadolu Kültür, there have been at least 3 structures, the cathedral, Surpurgic, and Tigran Honens, that have been restored. That is all through intense collaboration, lots of second-tier diplomatic negotiations between the ministry, people related to the Ministry of Culture of Turkey and related to the Ministry of Culture of Armenia, not official. UNESCO and various branches of the UN also have been working together, or had been working together with Anadolu Kültür until Osman Kavala was imprisoned now over 5 years ago. Honestly, his imprisonment has slowed a lot of this work down. So if you don't know who Osman Kavala is, please agitate for his release from prison.
To me, or who?
Okay. I will try to answer the question in connection with International Observer Mission to protect cultural heritage. We wish there was such an opportunity. Of course, there are efforts to make UNESCO commission into Karabakh, but somehow there might be some mission, but whether it's going to reflect what is happening on the ground, because we are talking about country which is very close in this regard. That is why we use satellite imagery, because there is no way we can get any idea what is happening on the ground. And not to say that if the mission goes, let's say, to Karabakh, let's say mission events goes to Shusha or Shushi, whichever option you prefer in terms of place name. Let's say commission went to Shusha, and they saw Kazan Chechotz is standing there. They wrote their report, and went to another cemetery which is standing there. What about many very small sites which are in the northern Karabakh, or in Kalbajar region, or in other places, which commission is not going to visit because those weren't regions legally being part of Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region. So what is going to happen to this heritage? Like if they are not observed in case there is an observer mission. So I'm completely hopeless that observer mission in any way going to protect most of the sites. And we also should be very careful how the state, which is somehow engaged in destruction, whether it's intentional or due to negligence of construction worker in the region, so how Azerbaijan is going to try to frame this monitoring mission, whether it's going to be in benefit of protecting that heritage, or just giving an Azerbaijan a kind of chance that taking those observers to some place where there is standing Armenian church, showing that there is Armenian church, and giving basically an option to propaganda, but also opportunity to erase other sites which are not visible in the region.
Okay, Peter, can you take your question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, to boil it down to some fundamental notions, the conversation that ensued between us and the executive editor really had to do with very fundamental education, delivering the discourse record, first in scholarship over the past, that is 2004, say over the past 25 years, and then the historiography of the period and the conceptual work of Lemkin, who used the Armenian genocide along with the Holocaust as his foundational notions for coming to conceptualize genocide as a crime in international law. I mean, after all, it was Lemkin who coined the term Armenian genocide. It wasn't Armenians. There was no term, before Lemkin. So, it had to do with having a kind of face-to-face conversation about concepts, history. By history, I mean historiography, and the record of scholarly work across nations and time. It was a gratifying conversation, but probably more things to say. But for now, I think that what's fundamental is to underscore that knowledge can be effective and a powerful, I hate to use the word tool, but a powerful force. And knowledge always has to be combating denial, whether it's about the 2020 election or about Ankara's propaganda mill or the tobacco companies, advertising cigarettes as health benefits. Redressing denial is a really important part of democratic culture and life.
Thank you, Peter. As you all know, we're moving toward our coffee break. But if there is one brief question that we could take, and I see two hands, and I saw one or three hands. So those I don't want to call on, hopefully they can take this up in the coffee break. So please.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully this will be brief. Thank you all. So this is mostly for Dr. Ghulyan and Dr. Goshgarian. I noticed that in some of the images of the destruction of cultural sites, there was notable damage to the land and environment. I'm wondering if that is part of what's being discussed in preservation of the cultural sites, and or if that's one way to approach preserving the cultural sites is working with environmentalism efforts internationally.
Thank you very much. This is, I think, is a very important question, because while focusing on heritage in Karabakh, by Karabakh I mean not only the Karabakh proper, but also these 7 adjacent districts. And I think not only Armenians, but also Azerbaijanis should care about this, because there's very huge construction work going on there right now, and we see that on satellite imagery, and which is not visible on Google Earth because it's from 4 years early period. So the amount of construction work, the amount of damage to landscape is huge in Karabakh. And I think in just last 3 years, probably Karabakh went much more infrastructural development than during the entire 30 years when it was under Armenian administration. So probably someone interested may do this kind of research trying to understand how all these developments change the entire landscapes, because we are talking about like what is going to happen in the region after 10 years. Or I'm not hopeful about Karabakh Armenians returning Azerbaijan at all, considering the discourse and general atmosphere in the region and like developments. But also, we should consider that after 20 or 30 years, Armenians, let's say, returning to Karabakh, they are not going to recognize not only the environment they are going to find themselves, but also the landscape as well. Just like Azerbaijanis who were ethnically cleansed in the 7 districts, when they return their village, they don't see anything, like from buildings, just ruins, you know. And probably, in some cases, Armenians might see this as well. But of course, this is depending on what kind of direction the conflict would evolve, because the conflict is not over. We don't know how it's going to evolve, in what direction. So environment is a very important issue. Why I mentioned both Armenians and Azerbaijanis should care about this, because they call it home. Armenians like a lot to talk about like being indigenous in the region. And being indigenous is just like indigenous is the being with nature. Armenians' focus is unfortunately mostly on culture heritage. I understand why, because it's the core of their identity when the issue comes to religious sites. But somehow they disregarded all the landscape, like the erasure of landscape taking place there. And Azerbaijanis as well, because they should be very critical to this as well. If President Aliyev or whoever talking about the topic, like Ghazan Chechev's church, you have heard that they are trying to turn it into its original form, which like during the late 80s. Okay, if you are turning that into its original form, what about the landscapes when Azerbaijanis, those people returning to the lands from where they were ethnically cleansed? Okay, you are building a house there or something else, but what about trying to preserve what remains from their landscape? But right now there's huge construction work there, and I think Azerbaijanis are not going to see the Karabakh they knew like 30 years ago, and probably Armenians as well, especially in a place like Shushi or Shusha. Well, especially in the Armenian part, you know, the entire western part of Shusha was formerly inhabited mostly by, it is the Armenian neighborhood. So it's the entire western part is construction zone in Shushi. So let's wait and see what is happening in terms of environmental damage as well. But it's a nice idea to just start to research, because it can be done like not only very expensive satellite imagery that we procure, but also like remote sensing technologies. There are plenty of free tools available for that people to explore this topic. Thank you.
Okay, well, we need to wrap up since there's a coffee break. We know that a lot of this infrastructure work is actually a form of denialism with the bulldozer and replacing what was there with something new, which we do on our own landscape all the time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Momjian. I'm a longtime board member of the Armenian Center at Columbia University. This has been an incredible conference, and we'll have an opportunity to thank the organizers at the end of this session. I'm very honored to chair this, the final session of today's conference at the School of Social Work. Our session is titled International Law and Human Rights. Allow me, please, by way of introduction, to offer a snippet of historical perspective from over a century ago. We know the facts. Under the cover of the Great War, the Armenian people were victims of a genocide resulting in the deaths of 1.5 million people killed in a systematic plan of racial extermination, or what was then classified as a crime against humanity. Here's how one New York journalist described the plight of the Armenian people in 1916. Just hear these words. "The life of the people is laid at the door of America. The Armenian nation, sufferer and martyr beyond all our present day, lies near death as a people. Unless aid comes, the race perishes from the face of the earth. All woe has come to it. Captivity, pestilence, the sword, starvation, half are gone. The rest starve and die. For 2 years, 1,000 a day have perished. For millions and leagues of long roads and trails, their bodies lie, men, women, children, dead as they fell. The remnant is in the desert where no food is, dying of scores, by hundreds, by thousands, by hundreds of thousands. Driven by the sword from their homes to a long tramp of 500 to 600 miles, what the sword spared, the desert has slain. What the desert left, the pestilence has smitten. And hunger has followed to end a people scattered, wounded, and forsaken. It is as though all the population of Kansas were driven, headlong, helpless masses, all the blood-stained way to the Rio Grande. They're dying as they march for food in a desert of unsown fields, eating of the wild. The Armenian remnant waits American aid as the one hope left." Who said these poignant words? The journalist Talcott Williams, the first dean of Columbia University's School of Journalism, built and endowed by Joseph Pulitzer. As a member of the American Committee for Syrian and Armenian Relief, Williams repeatedly called rhetoric to account by denouncing the perpetrators of the atrocities. Dozens of Columbia University administrators and professors, including its president, followed suit. But a global chorus of denunciation would bring no measure of justice to the survivors of the genocide. Today, the depths of human cruelty have once again perpetrated the heart of the Armenian people, this time in Artsakh, where last month over 120,000 Armenians were forcibly deported from their ancestral homeland. This afternoon, I am honored to introduce a distinguished panel to speak about the international law applications of the recent war crimes committed against the Armenians of Artsakh, and hopefully to provide a human rights framework to better understand not simply the gravity of these forced deportations, but to aim our focus on advocacy for the survivors. Our award-winning and internationally acclaimed panelists offer varying perspectives on these and other topics, as they have expertise in international criminal law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, and advocacy on behalf of victims of genocide and ethnic cleansing. They are all tireless crusaders for justice, renowned globally for promoting human dignity and freedom, and equally for condemning those who commit planned mass human annihilation. Our first speaker is Dr. Melanie O'Brien. She is a visiting professor for the Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is also president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Dr. O'Brien has served as an expert consultant for several UN bodies. Her 2022 book, From Discrimination to Death, Genocide Process Through a Human Rights Lens, is a landmark work in the field of genocide studies. She will be followed by Sheila Pylon, a public international law and human rights expert with more than 15 years of experience working for the United Nations as an advisor on complex matters of international criminal, humanitarian, and human rights law, as well as administrative law and conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. She regularly consults for a variety of international organizations, NGOs, think tanks, and governments, and has published on the subjects of atrocity crimes, remedial secession, and the responsibility to protect. In the aftermath of the 2022 Karabakh War, Ms. Pylon provided expert advice to various departments and ministries of the government of Armenia on matters of international law. She frequently is called upon to speak, write, and participate on panels about the war and its aftermath, on the concept of remedial secession, the doctrine of responsibility to protect, and its application to the war. In 2022, she was presented with the Legal Advocate of the Year award by the Center for Truth and Justice for dedicating her professional career to the advancement of human rights. Our final speaker will be Sarah Lee Whitson, the Executive Director of Dawn Democracy for the Arab World. She previously served as Director of the Middle East and North African Division of Human Rights Watch, overseeing the work of the division in 19 countries. Ms. Whitson has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the Arab-speaking world, focusing on armed conflict, legal reforms, and human rights, among other areas. She publishes widely on human rights and foreign policy, both here in the U.S. and abroad. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and on the board of the International Center for Justice for Palestinians. In May of this year, she was honored at the Yale Club here in New York with the Armenian Bar Association's Public Servant Award for championing democracy and human rights in the Arab world. Thank you very much. That is our panel. We will start with Dr. O'Brien. Please welcome them.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the organisers for having me here. I hope you don't mind a second Australian lawyer crashing your panel today. I am kind of proud that this year I was given an honorary Armenian name, Melina O'Brien. So I hope to go by that at future Armenian events. Before I get started on my presentation, I would like to answer a question that has been asked, which is international law even effective? And I'm going to start by answering that by putting the question out to you. Would you ever ask, is criminal law even effective? You wouldn't. You wouldn't ask it about another body of law. So why international law? But why do we have the expectation that international law has to be 100% perfect? Because we do not have that expectation for other areas of law. So I'm just going to start with that. And I do want to say that international law is effective. What we don't see make the headlines are the stories of compliance with international law that happen every single day. For example, we don't see the story of when an ambulance is allowed through a checkpoint in armed conflict because it's not newsworthy. But these kinds of things happen every day, compliance with international law. So we can criticize it, but I think that question is kind of pointless because that's not getting us anywhere. Because international law does make for a better place. If we didn't have it, we would have total war, there would be no restraint, we would have no regulations on states, but states do choose to comply with international law and do so every single day. Just not all of them, all the time. So today I wanted to talk about, but before I talk about that, I want to do something which I'm surprised that I have not seen today, and that's a land acknowledgement, because we are today meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Mannahatta, the homelands of the Lenni Lenape and Wapinja peoples. And I would like to acknowledge that. We talk today about cultural destruction and genocide, and yet no one has acknowledged that we are on lands that were violently taken from the people that lived on these lands beforehand. So, I'm going to talk to you about the International Criminal Court, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a couple of crimes, because I can't possibly cover everything today. But I want to talk about the ICC because everyone asks me about it. So I know that most people in here aren't lawyers, and you'll have, it's difficult to understand the law. So I want to tell you about it and how it's working and what kind of solution that will be. Now, I'm talking about international criminal law, so I'm talking about individual criminal accountability. I'm not talking about accountability of the state. And when I say the state, that's international law talk for the country, so the government, essentially. So I'm going to focus on individual criminal accountability. Now, when it comes to the International Criminal Court, we have two countries that we're talking about, Azerbaijan and Armenia. Unsurprisingly, Azerbaijan is not a state party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The Rome Statute is the founding document of the court, and it is a treaty, which means that only states that ratify it are bound by it. So therefore, Azerbaijan is not bound by it. What about Armenia? So Armenia is not a state party yet, but they are very close to being so. So there's a little bit of an interesting history there. In 2004, there was an Armenian Constitutional Court ruling that the constitution was incompatible with Armenia ratifying the Rome Statute of the ICC, and so therefore that didn't happen. In the years after that, eventually there were some amendments made to the Constitution, and in March of this year, the Constitutional Court issued another ruling that said now the Constitution, ratifying the Rome Statute would not contradict our Constitution. So we can go forward with that ratification. So that was really great news. The result of that, which happened around the same time that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, was that Russia was quite angry about this and threatened that there would be serious consequences for Armenia. And obviously, as we know, and we've talked about here today, that close relationship between Russia and Armenia is quite significant. But I'm really proud that Armenia has not bowed to Russia's threats. And on the 2nd of October, so just over a month ago, the Armenian parliament voted to join the ICC. And on the 13th of October, the Armenian president approved the parliament's decision ratifying the Rome Statute and agreeing to retroactive recognition of the ICC's jurisdiction. And I'll come back to that in red in a moment. So the next step is that that ratification that the president has done has to be deposited at the UN. So because it's a treaty, that's a necessary step in the process. And what will happen then is the first day of the month, after the 60th day following the deposit of that ratification with the UN, the Rome Statute will come into force in Armenia. So we're not sure when that will be. Obviously, it depends. So I've said maybe February, because if they deposit the ratification this month, then it would be in February. So just keep an eye on the news for when you see they've announced they've deposited that ratification. So that time frame doesn't come from Armenia. That time frame actually comes from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, giving that 60 days leeway after ratification deposit. So I said I'd come back to the red bit, agreeing to retroactive recognition of the ICC's jurisdiction. So the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction is complex, but the relevant part here is that it only has jurisdiction over crimes committed from the 1st of July 2002 onwards, which is when the court came into being. But it also says that if a state signs up, if they ratify the Rome Statute, that will only have effect from that date for that country. With the exception, if that country also deposits a declaration that it will accept retroactive jurisdiction of the court. So Armenia has done that. So that is part of their ratification. They have put a declaration with it. And of course, that's really, really important here, because it means what they're saying is that the International Criminal Court will have jurisdiction over anything associated with Armenia, but not just from February next year. So it will be back in time. So that means we're talking about covering the period of the 2020 war. I'm not sure of the date that they have put into that declaration. I haven't been able to find a text of it yet. So I'm not sure whether they have said back to the 1st of July 2002 or not, but I think we can at least guarantee that they will have made it retrospective to cover the 2020 war. Now, what does this mean? Jurisdiction also has other parameters to it, and one of them is that it only gives the ICC jurisdiction over crimes committed in Armenian territory or by Armenians. So that means, for example, that those of you who are Armenian citizens, if you committed an international crime today in the United States, well, not today, let's say in March in the United States, but you would be possibly subject to the ICC's jurisdiction because you are an Armenian citizen. So that's really relevant because it means that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over crimes committed in Azerbaijani territory. And as we know, legally, Artsakh is situated in Azerbaijan territory. So I am, however, going to talk about how we can get around that as I go on. But what I want to say is that ICC involvement, if they do get involved, if they do open an investigation, it could definitely and would definitely result in positive attention and support to the plight of those who have fled, now I can say, now who have fled Artsakh and the situation in Artsakh. So this would be a really positive thing if the prosecutor were to take up this investigation. And I think we could assume that going forward, hopefully the Armenian government will refer the situation to the prosecutor of the ICC so that he can investigate that. I do want to note, however, of course, that this would open up potential prosecutions of Armenian citizens, including any allegations of crimes committed by Armenian soldiers. And there have been some minor, obviously nowhere in the league of those allegations against Azerbaijanis. But what I would say is I would like to see Armenia take the lead and investigate any of those allegations and show that they are the bigger country by doing that. And so to take action if there are those kinds of allegations. So coming back to territory, creative prosecutorial decisions could mean that the ICC would have jurisdiction, even though the majority of the crimes are committed in the territory of Azerbaijan. So by doing that, they could draw from what we've seen so far in the Bangladesh-Myanmar case, looking at the Rohingya people, before the ICC. So, and I'm going to expand on that in a moment. Before I expand on that, I just want to quickly show you a slide of a list of some of the war crimes that have been alleged to have been committed by Azerbaijani soldiers against Armenians, against citizens of Artsakh. And this is not all of them, but this is a list. But I just want you to bear in mind that I'm saying these are there because I'm going to come back to the commission of crimes as I go on. So, ethnic cleansing. This is clearly what has happened. Despite the media reporting, oh, it's the beginning of ethnic cleansing. No, it was ethnic cleansing. That's what it means when everyone is moved out. So these definitions that I've put up there are generally the ones that are used when we talk about ethnic cleansing, coming from reports by the Commission of Experts who looked at violations of the laws of war in the former Yugoslavia. But I do want to make clear that ethnic cleansing doesn't exist in international law. It's not an international crime. So we talk about ethnic cleansing, but we can't prosecute it. So I'm going to tell you how the ICC can prosecute it. What we'd use instead is the crime against humanity of deportation. And this is what the court is using in the Bangladesh-Myanmar case. So Myanmar is not a party to the International Criminal Court, but Bangladesh is. So what the court is arguing is that the crime of deportation, which requires the victims to cross a border, starts in Myanmar and finishes in Bangladesh. So this is not uncommon in criminal law. This is kind of pretty standard. So essentially, you have a border and a crime can start in one country and it can finish in another. This is a perfectly normal application of criminal law. And of course, we have a lot of transnational, transboundary crimes that take place. But it's really interesting to see it being used in this way to enable the ICC to have jurisdiction. So in using that, why we use deportation when we can't use ethnic cleansing, and what I want to show you here is essentially what it means. So this is the forced displacement of people. And I want to draw attention to what this idea of force and coercion means because, of course, we have seen Azerbaijan argue that people left of their own choice and their own volition, which is just insanity because it's not normal that 120,000 people suddenly just decide to leave their house. So how would we use this to make that argument against the Azerbaijani claims? So when we talk about forcible transfer, it is not about physical force necessarily, although I want to reiterate that we of course saw physical force with the bombings in September, but it may also include threat of force or coercion. So this idea of coercion or coercive environment is something that has been explored by international courts in other trials. So they talk about coercion being inherent in certain circumstances, such as armed conflict or the presence of military. So, tick, we've got both of those going on. There was an armed conflict and there was the presence of military in Artsakh. They also have said they can infer non-consent, so coercion, from background circumstances such as an ongoing genocide campaign or the detention of the victims. And of course, we can think about detention more broadly and think about the siege and the fact that the people in Artsakh were not free to leave. In another case from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, they said circumstances giving rise to this appeal and that prevail in most cases charged as either war crimes or crimes against humanity will be almost universally coercive. So they've just said the circumstances in which these kinds of crimes are committed are just coercive as they exist. So you don't even, in a way, need to analyse it. The International Criminal Court has also touched on this. They've said coercive environments amount to military presence of hostile forces, combat situation, and other crimes. So other crimes is why I wanted to show you that list of war crimes, because this is the context of what we're talking about, the commission of an extensive range of war crimes. So therefore, and military presence, we're talking about, the existence of armed conflict, the detention of victims, and the vulnerability of victims. Tick, 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 tick. All of these are there. So nobody can argue that these were not coercive circumstances. And so therefore, we can definitely argue that this was deportation, forced displacement over the border. So as I mentioned, deportation has to cross borders. And so the ICC is allowing jurisdiction to investigate the crimes against the Rohingya because the Rohingya crossed the border as they fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And that could apply here. So we could say the citizens of Artsakh crossed the border into Armenia, and therefore that would give the ICC jurisdiction over the crime of deportation. So essentially, this is the crime being committed at least in part on Armenia's territory. So that is what, and I realize I'm running out of time and I haven't even got to the genocide discussion yet. But I really wanted to show you that about deportation to show you how the ICC can be used once it comes into force in Armenia. I won't be able to go through it in detail, but I do want to say that, issues of the crime of genocide, so the crime of deliberately inflicting conditions of life designed to bring about the physical destruction. I argue that this took place with the siege of Artsakh and the blocking of the Lachin corridor. And courts have found that this crime can include denial of medical services and deprivation of food, which I think were two of the most serious issues that arose from that siege, that blockade of Artsakh. But I think what's really important here as well, legally, you don't have to prove that conditions actually led to death. So that argument can be made. So, obviously we knew there was at least one man that died of starvation, and we've heard today of people dying on the way out because of their chronic health conditions, but you don't even need to prove that. It's just about inflicting those conditions in the first place. I'm going to end there because otherwise I'm going to go over time, but thank you. Any questions open to?
We'll have questions at the end. We'll have time for questions at the end. Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. We'll come back and maybe have a more full discussion on the genocide issue that you had in the last panels. Sheila Pylon. Is the red button on?
Oh, no, it's on. Okay. Hi. All right, well, I have to admit, I had another speech prepared, but as I was going over it this morning, very early this morning, thanks to jet lag, I realized it wasn't quite what I felt needed to be discussed right now. And after hearing the content and quality of the presentations today, I'm glad I changed course. I can't believe the turnout today. There are people sitting in the stairs. I mean, and it's a Saturday, so it's really incredible. Definitely worth the very long trip from Armenia. I had planned to talk about the laws on the violations of the right to property, how to seek redress, the continued right of return, the right of self-determination, all of which, of course, are fundamental human rights, very worthy of discussion and consideration. But I feel that there's a more fundamental problem that needs talking through at this particular time. I agree with Dr. O'Brien, of course, that international law is effective, but we are witnessing violations on an unprecedented scale with little consequence, and that is disturbing. I want to talk about that. Like, what are these rights good for if they're not being enforced or enforceable? What's the point in me describing those laws to you if we're watching, you know, like I said, these violations on an unprecedented scale? I don't need to remind anyone here about the horrors that the Armenian people have had to endure and bear witness to in the last weeks, months, and years. Today's conference has already refreshed all of our memories of all that. And even for me, having spent my entire 15-plus year career so far working on war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocides, including in conflict zones throughout the world, what I witnessed last month brought me to my knees and triggered a sense of loss and despair that I have not fully recovered from yet. This is not just because, as an ethnic Armenian, I identify with the group against which a mass atrocity has just taken place, or that by living and working in Armenia, I am in very close proximity to the people and location where that mass atrocity just took place. Of course, this plays a part, but it's not just that. It's because anyone who actually cares about what's happening outside of their immediate sphere of interest and existence cannot help but realize that we are really currently experiencing a moment of profound human suffering globally. And the current, seemingly never-ending plight of the Armenians is just one very potent example of that. Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, put it really well in an article published in The Guardian yesterday. A pandemic of inhumanity has taken hold from Darfur to Ukraine, from the plight of women and girls in Afghanistan to the seemingly forgotten voices of the Rohingya refugees in Myanmar, and now the intolerable tragedy that is deepening in Israel and the state of Palestine and threatening to spread wider. He didn't mention the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, but he also didn't mention the Tigrayans of Ethiopia, the Uyghurs of China, or basically the entire population of Eastern Congo, because the word count probably was restricted. But of course, they also bear mentioning. These human rights emergencies are all interconnected, and at their heart, they are driven by a common crisis, which is the failure to give value to the lives of all people. This dark chapter in current history serves as a stark reminder of the grave consequences of silence and the rise of authoritarianism in our world. There is an unprecedented rise of authoritarianism in international law, and it is having a severely detrimental impact on the Human Rights Project. The principles that underpin human rights are fundamental to the well-being and dignity of every individual, transcending borders and cultures. So as we witness a resurgence of authoritarianism on the global stage, our collective responsibility to defend these principles has become extremely urgent. Authoritarianism disregards democratic values, the rule of law, and individual freedoms. It poses a direct threat to the very foundation of international law. And we find ourselves at a critical juncture where the forces of autocracy are challenging the universality and integrity of human rights. This is not a distant problem that affects just a handful of nations. It's a scourge that undermines the collective effort to build a just and equitable world. And so to confront this scourge, we have to acknowledge the gravity of the situation and the need for a united front. We can't be silent. We can't fail to act anymore. These are no longer options. The defense of human rights really needs collective courage, unwavering commitment, and a strategic approach to counteract the corrosive forces at play. When we are confronted, as we are now, with the shocking calamity of the total ethnic cleansing of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, it's something unprecedented. I mean, it's total. We don't give in to despair. We don't give in to that little voice that is also in my head that whispers, there's nothing more that I or we or anyone can do. If it seems like nobody can hear us scream anymore, we don't stop screaming. We scream louder and we scream longer. We name aggressors, we demand accountability for war criminals, we call things out as we see them, as we know them, and we don't allow fear of retaliation to take over. And not just for our own cause, but for every other cause that looks even remotely like ours. Because much as we would like to think so, we are not unique in this. And so as much as our plight should be everyone else's concern, everyone else's plight should be our concern as well. We also never allow cynicism to take hold. We don't listen to those who call us naive for holding on to our humanitarian values or ideals in a world where realpolitik screams otherwise. We hold steady and we double down on our efforts to move the needle in the right direction. We focus on the glimpses of light that remain in the architecture of international law and human rights, and their manifestation because they're there. There's actually nothing wrong with the law. The international laws that prohibit aggression and atrocity crimes and human rights violations are perfectly robust. But it is the enforcement mechanism or the lack thereof that is the problem. It's all fine for the Secretary General of the United Nations to tweet that wars have rules and that they must be respected. But then what? I mean, we know that. What if they're not being respected? What if the UN Security Council keeps ending in a deadlock in handling countries and situations that so heinously break those rules? What do? Well, we don't throw in the towel. Instead, we not only advocate for, but we demand in creative ways, in every way, shape, or form that we can think of for the robust enforcement of existing international laws and the creation of mechanisms to hold authoritarian leaders accountable for their actions. And you don't need to be a lawyer to do this. Anyone can call for strengthening institutions such as the International Criminal Court and supporting investigations into human rights violations. These are crucial steps towards ensuring that those who perpetrate atrocities are brought to justice. Which is why, even in the midst of this all-enveloping darkness that has befallen the Armenian people once again, when there are some glimpses of light, it's more essential now than ever not to dismiss them, but rather to catch them, cling to them like our lives depend on them, because they do, and run with them. The brightest rays of light that we have at the moment in terms of international legal and human rights avenues are Armenia's cases before the European Court of Human Rights and the International Court of Justice. And now, as Dr. O'Brien has so masterfully discussed, Armenia's ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Without this ratification, real viable justice for crimes committed against Armenians would be impossible. Justice is our birthright, and Armenia's move to ratify the ICC statute in the midst of so much pressure from Russia not to is an act of such boldness and bravery that we can only stand in awe thereof. wait, rather than attacking such a move, which many have, we should rather be inspired by it to work tirelessly on turning that new possibility for justice into a reality. The other most important glimpse of light, and it's related, is the arrest warrant that the ICC has issued against Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was unimaginable before, but what it does is it sends a clear signal to someone like President Ilham Aliyev and other despotic criminal leaders just like him, that they are no longer immune from prosecution or otherwise untouchable. What these glimpses, among others, show is that we can't give up on Artsakh. We don't need to give up on Artsakh. We now have options for justice, and so we shouldn't buy into the idea or rhetoric that the Nagorno-Karabakh issue is over. It's far from over. And if anything, we're just getting started. We're getting closer and closer each day with every glimpse of light that we don't discard to getting the justice and accountability that Armenians, as well as other victims of atrocity crimes, so rightly deserve. And with each step, as we move towards justice, we restore the dignity, freedom, and well-being of every individual on this planet. I'll end on that note. I don't know why that was so hard. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pylon. Our final speaker on this session is Sarah Lee Whitson, and she's going to be speaking from down below.
Yeah, I have a sprained ankle, which is limiting my mobility.
Turn the mic on.
All right, it's done. Okay. I'm just curious, before I deliver some pretty impromptu remarks, how many people here are Armenian? All right. So thank you to the non-Armenians here. Because I think your presence here is what gives me the most hope for optimism, the most belief that collectively our voices can make a difference. And I want all the Armenians here to think about the presence of non-Armenians here and think about how many conferences you've gone to about other genocides, whether of the Rohingya, whether, I can name a lot of places. You want Ukraine, you want Palestine. But I hope that we consider this as a cue that for all of the victim communities, we are really only stronger if we come together. And if we start and stand as isolated little communities, the Armenians will be the first to lose because we're the smallest, and it's a bit surreal for me to be here, to be talking about the issues that we're talking about, whether it's forced displacement of the Armenians who were forcibly displaced from Artsakh, the right to return of refugees, war crimes, the destruction of cemeteries, and so forth, when, as I'm sure you all know, these crimes are happening on a much more massive scale right now, today, as we speak, in Gaza. And I've heard a lot of people sort of rightfully frustrated and hurt that the international community has forgotten them, has not done enough to help them, has not done enough to support them. Think about what the Palestinian people feel right now. Not only is all of that true, but the leader of the free world, the leader of so-called democracies of the world, is arming what I believe we will very soon be concluding is a genocide of the Palestinian people. So it makes it very difficult to, approach this conversation with the confidence and strength of being a human rights practitioner or an international law expert. And I feel that Sheila's sentiments are matched by my own, and I'm sorry that I'm not going to be leaving you with more inspiring remarks. But part of our job is to confront the dark reality that we're facing and not accept placebos and not accept sweet talk and, from my perspective at least, not believe, because I see the reality in front of my eyes, that international law is enough. And, you know, Melanie, to the point you were making, the problem with international law as I see it, the reason why I believe it's, you know, apparently pretty dead in many parts of the world, is that there is no enforcement. You know, criminal law, at least there's enforcement. Maybe the enforcement is good, maybe the enforcement is bad. But in the case of international law, entire vast territories of the world, there's zero enforcement of international law. And yet, the United States goes around lecturing other countries, most recently Putin in Ukraine, about respecting international law. And I think that this war in Gaza in particular, if the ICC fails to prosecute Israeli war criminals as they should be prosecuted, will be the death of the International Criminal Court. I believe that member states of the International Criminal Court, this is going to be the death knell of the court, and you will see African states in particular who've been on the cusp of leaving the court, leave the court. And it will be the end of any notion that the United States is going to stand around and lecture other countries, whether it's China or Russia, about respect for international law or international humanitarian law. The United States, in the past 10 days, has on 2 occasions, the official State Department spokesman on 2 occasions has refused to say that the United States supports the Geneva Conventions and believes they are applicable to the conflict in Gaza today. The United States has made clear that they are willing to abandon international law, not just the International Criminal Court, which they pick up and play with when they feel like never being a party to it, but that the whole body of international law itself is something that they will flush down the toilet if it means criticizing Israel, if it means holding Israel to the standards of international law. And that's another reason why I am beginning to believe that international law is dead, and our own country, our own government has played a leading role in killing it. For me, the litmus test of international law, you know, and maybe hard cases make bad law, we know that, but for me, the litmus test for international law, for human rights, for the laws of war, is Palestine. Because it is the case when the leading champions of free speech here in Columbia University are willing to shut down student organizations rather than have them speak to call for a ceasefire, speak to demand an end to Israeli atrocities. And Columbia University is not the only one, where journalists are being fired from their jobs for being critical of Israel, but where Israel has declared officially, publicly, that it will treat journalists as terrorists if they are documenting Israeli atrocities, and where it has said publicly that it will treat and is treating surgeons, doctors, medical workers, ambulance drivers as terrorists because they are still in hospitals where Hamas may be operating underground in tunnels. So the sort of most sacred sort of bodies of people who are meant to be immune from targeting journalists and medical workers, the distinctions are gone. Israel has said to the world, we refuse to recognize the distinction between civilian and combatant. Those categories are irrelevant to us. Our category is terrorist and who we believe is a terrorist. And the United States has had nothing to say, and that's why the United States is not even willing to say, yes, we recognize the Geneva Conventions and its applicability to the conflict. Husik had asked me here to talk a little bit about my own human rights activism and my own work, and I think he was counting on me being a little more inspirational, but you know, I have been living, eating, breathing, drinking the atrocities in Gaza since October 9, and of course shocked and horrified by the atrocities in Israel on October 7. So it has been very difficult to disassociate and think about anything else other than these sad conclusions that I am reaching, and really the confirmation, because I probably don't have a lot of time and we can talk about it more rather than talk about the work that I've done, the conclusions that I've reached, and I think they're as relevant to the Armenian community, as relevant to any human rights advocacy community, as relevant to any international law experts, is it's not enough. What I've learned over the past 30 years of human rights investigation, monitoring, documentation, advocacy, where the fundamental drive for our work is, well, if we reveal the facts, if we document the atrocities, then certainly the action, the right action, the accountability, the intervention, the protection will follow. And what I have seen is that that's just not true. Now, every single bomb that dropped in Syria, every single village and town that was destroyed by Syria was live streamed practically. Citizen journalism, I think, found its fullest expression during the Syrian civil war. And yet, that war continues. What I've learned is that documentation and evidence gathering and petitions to courts is just not enough, particularly if we are dealing with our country where we do live in a democracy, but where foreign policy and the foreign policies of our government are completely disconnected from democracy, completely disconnected from the will of the voters and the will of the people, and are captive to defense industry interests and foreign government interests and influence. And so I think for any human rights activist, for anyone who's interested in international law, your project must be political. Your project must be taking on and fighting the influencers, those with money and resources and power who are disrupting our democracy, who are pulling the plug from our democracy to control people like Biden and Blinken like no more than puppets. And part of the reason why I'm currently engaged on legislative reform, on laws that will prohibit government and military officials from working for foreign governments or doing business with foreign governments after they leave is, to the rest of us, I think it's pretty clear that creates a nasty conflict of interest. But I believe it is as integral to our work to succeed, to be able to influence our government officials, is to make sure that our government officials are not captive, are not corrupted by these defense industry interests and foreign government interests. And I think we saw that play out pretty clearly here in the United States with respect to Artsakh. And I think we all understand that the American government, which oh so loves the Armenian people and oh so cherishes our democracy and even gives us bonus points for being Christians, had little to say and little to do, and we all know why the petrodollar spending of Azerbaijan played the decisive role in where the US government ended up in this conflict. So I think I'll pause there because I have a feeling I've talked too long as it is. Thank you.
All right. Wow.
I didn't read any of my remarks that I actually had prepared.
I'm glad your foot is down here. I mean, I don't know what would. No, chair's privilege. I'm going to start with the first question, and then we're going to open it up. We're good on time. Criminal defendants get indicted, they get charged, they don't show. Sometimes they're tried in absentia. Lawyers are trained never to ask a question for which they don't know the answer. Is it, I don't know the answer to this, has an ICC or Rome Statute signatory ever been charged with a war crime and the defendant signatory did not show up and just said, you know, try the country in absentia, see what it matters? Has that ever happened?
Okay, so first of all, just a quick international law thing. If you're a signatory, you're not bound by a treaty, so you have to ratify the treaty. Those are two separate steps, but quite important in terms of thinking about what the obligations of that country are. Secondly, the Rome Statute isn't about state accountability. It's only individual criminal accountability. So they can only prosecute individuals. For state accountability, that's the International Court of Justice. So the International Court of Justice was designed to oversee disputes between states, but the ICC is about criminal prosecution of individuals. And we have seen self-referrals, so states in Africa that are a party to the Rome Statute, they joined and they referred situations in their own countries, and people have been prosecuted. Admittedly, and I was only recently reading the stats on how well the cases have gone, which hasn't been great because there have been acquittals, there have been situations with issues around evidence, and so they haven't all resulted in convictions. But yes, states have referred themselves and they have had their own people prosecuted before the ICC. The one thing is, though, that they generally tend to be more the rebel leaders rather than the actual heads of state. But we have the situation in Sudan, which was referred by the Security Council, so Darfur, Sudan, to the Security Council to the International Criminal Court, and an arrest warrant was issued for the then President al-Bashir of Sudan, who I'm not sure where the process is at, but there's a consideration of whether he will be tried in the domestic fora or whether he will actually be surrendered to the ICC at some point. But those kind of things, you know, dictators they either die and then we get rid of them, or they're not in power forever and then we can come after them. So I always have that hope. It happened to Charles Taylor. He was prosecuted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone and is in prison for life. So it's not impossible. Like, I do have some hope, and there has been so much more activity in international law around holding states and holding individuals accountable.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. Questions from our audience? We're going to start in the back here. And we're going to, because of our time limitations, let's try to keep the commentary and get right to the question if we could.
Okay, my question's for Sarah, and she made a comment about the influencers and the doctors and the journalists being protected. Well, one thing that's happening now with Israel is the business community. I'm from real estate finance, and there are massive lists being prepared. You're with us, you're without us, on social media, my alumni base, and it's pretty much out of control. And it's even in the college and graduate school where I teach also. Like, how are we supposed to? How does the population respond when it's gone so far over? Do we get defended? People are losing jobs over this, and they're not. You know, they're Americans losing jobs because of the finance industry is controlled by the Jewish population in the United States. And it's not government, it's...
Okay. And this is a conference on Artsakh, but can you contextualize that for us, or do you want to?
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, I mean, you know, on the one hand, there is unprecedented...
The mic is on.
It is on. Oh, sorry. On the one hand, I'll just shove my face in closer. There's unprecedented support for Palestinian rights, unprecedented outrage at the atrocities underway, and I think that's why we're seeing sort of this intense reaction and effort to control that and to punish people who are expressing those views. You know, we've always had one or two professors not getting tenured or not getting jobs or getting job offers rescinded because they're seen as being pro-Palestinian. But now they are after everybody who is expressing those views. And because of social media, people are expressing those views. So in the private sector, almost everywhere, you can fire anyone for any reason unless it's a protected class. So age, gender, sexuality, race, religion are banned grounds for firing someone, but political views is not a protected grounds. I think that there will be little remedy for people who are shunned from the private sector in this way. And this is why I was very critical of the American corporate industry getting behind Ukraine as a political cause or getting behind LGBT for a political cause, because guess what? When they're not on your side, when they're not on your political cause, you've given them a very strong weapon to openly deploy, including firing people for taking views they don't like. And unfortunately, there's no legal remedy for that, but I think this is where the responsibility of our government leaders comes in, to set the tone, to set the expectations of how it wants the private sector to behave, to potentially pass legislation that gives people due process protections for being terminated for political views that has nothing to do with their job and no impact on their job. But that would be a very, very uphill measure. And I think this is where people are going to be basically bullied into silence or make the choice to say, I'm not going to be bullied. I will pay the consequence, but I'm not going to be bullied.
Okay.
And if there are enough people, then it will not work.
Okay. I have to say something. I don't want any more tropes said. This is a free speech forum, but I really must pose what your comment was, which I think many people would think is classified as anti-Semitic, talking about tropes like that. I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to give it a rest. It is a free country, and I'm talking. She can, you know what? I'm allowed to say what I have to say, and I'm not going to sit here while that happens. Professor Terrio.
Yeah, I'm going to follow that up. I want to say this. I want to say this respectfully, but I think there's a difference between a universal human rights approach where you're seeking out the groups that nobody's talking about, nobody's defending, and nobody's dealing with. And there, and sorry, I'm sorry, Shill, I really appreciate you trying to highlight some of those cases. One of the big issues that we're seeing right now is, you're exactly right, Mark. This is a discussion of Artsakh, right? Now, under other circumstances, it's great to bring in Israel-Palestine. But in a case where very explicitly and intentionally Armenian issues, as well as many other groups, have been pushed out precisely because everybody is talking about Israel-Palestine. This is one of the only places probably in New York City today, probably the only place where Armenians are being talked about. There are probably 100 places Israel-Palestine is being talked about. And I do really have to question why, again, this little tiny sliver of attention to Armenian issues gets pushed out because of, quite honestly, I don't know how to say this the right way, a kind of media bias, a political bias, and all sorts of other things. I'm all for, as Armenians, talking about the groups that are even less visible than we are. And I did that today, and others have done that. But I do think we really have to take a second to think about what our focus is and why, and also whether we're reinforcing, I hate to say it, a kind of victim hierarchy that we're seeing that has played out in very dramatic ways, including for me being told in an interview I did, oh yeah, we're tabling that because Israel-Palestine is what matters, Armenians, who cares, that kind of stuff. So I really want to think about that a little bit and think about what that means for universal human rights and a balance of power over who counts and who doesn't, and what we really need to do to universalize what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much. Sure. Go ahead.
I have a question for each based on what you said. So I have a question for the international, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, the lady from Australia.
Dr. O'Brien.
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 So if you were to, so what would you do if we knew for a fact, for example, that going on with the deal would compromise Armenia's national security? Let's say we were pretty sure it would because of the implications. Should we go? Should we even consider it if we know because who knows if you guys are even going to catch him in the first place? And if we end up losing our national security, what good does it do for us anyway? And it's probably going to be forgotten about. And for the lady in the middle again, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
And just try to
Important thing is I remember your speeches and I'm replying to that. So you know how you said you're happy to see non-Armenians here? That was here? Oh, I'm sorry.
What's your question, please?
I'm sorry. Okay, still my question. Maybe you can answer this because I remember what you said, most of it. So even though we're right about most of these ideas, I agree with them, but don't you think that it's kind of, it's going to be very difficult for someone to challenge these ideas in a group full of Armenians? We don't really.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much.
And then my last question.
No, listen, you have two questions. Okay. We want other people to get an opportunity. I'm sorry. Do you want to address the question more generally?
So I assume when you said going on with the deal, you mean by ratifying the Rome Statute. Well, that ship has sailed. They've done it. It's ratified. They just have to deposit it. So it's going to happen. And when you said, who knows if we're going to catch him in the first place, do you mean Putin? Or are you talking about Azerbaijani Putin? Yeah, I mean, they may not. That's the problem for the ICC is they don't have a police force, so they are reliant on state police forces to capture and surrender, state law enforcement to do that. So that is a problem, obviously. But, you know...
National security, though, if it gets compromised?
I'm not a national security expert. I'm an international law expert.
What should we do if we know that it's going to compromise us?
Yeah,
Should we...
Sheila can take that.
Let someone answer the question, please.
You're assuming that it's a national security threat. You're also assuming that the Armenian government hasn't already gone through the process of determining whether it is. Don't interrupt
Their
me.
track record,
Don't interrupt me.
Please.
Yeah. The Armenian government has offered the Russians bilateral agreement to assure them that they will not arrest Putin. They have done everything that they can do to appease Russia. Russia has already shown itself to be hostile towards Armenia. There's nothing that Armenia can do to prevent Russian, whatever misbehavior. So Armenia is a sovereign nation, is taking the steps it needs to take to protect itself, including by increasing its international legal toolbox to deter Azerbaijani aggression. And if we look for every reason to chip away at Armenia's sovereignty and make assumptions based on Russian propaganda that our national security is threatened when it's actually just mostly, ridiculous. If our sovereignty is being threatened because we're taking a stand, then that's for no reason other than ego or pride or what have you, then I think that Armenia has a responsibility to stand up to that. Otherwise, it loses its sovereignty and it's even more dangerous. But I don't think that there's as much of a national security threat as is in your mind. And if there really, really were, I don't think Armenia would go through with this.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Ara?
Thank you, Mark. Could the panel examine the validity of the act of dissolution that was signed by the Artsakh president? And what steps could be taken to preserve statehood and avoid actions that could fatally compromise statehood in the future? Thanks.
That is where politics and law don't always, they're more like oil and water. The dissolution agreement, to me as a lawyer, it's invalid because it was procured under duress. Now, that doesn't mean anything if other countries don't recognize Artsakh, which they never did, including Armenia. That was a very, very important missing link. There's no way I could go through the whole gamut of like what could be done to restore Artsakh. I think that we have a very, very good case now more than ever for the need for remedial secession. And even when international lawyers tell me, well, what's the point of even talking about it if there are no Armenians left in Artsakh? I say, if you want to live in a world where that's okay, then you keep saying that. I think that there's no way Armenians can go back to Artsakh without remedial secession. And if there was ever a case for it, this is it. Now, none of that really matters if countries are not going to support Artsakh in that endeavor, and number one being Armenia. So it doesn't, that's what my whole speech was about. That's not a reason to give up. I'm not going to give up. I think that that's when the final nail in the coffin goes down. But yeah, it's a really tricky one. But unfortunately, given the very real act of ethnic cleansing, which actually does constitute international crimes, the responsibility to protect this population has been seriously violated, and the international community has a responsibility to rectify that. And I think that one way of doing that would be to grant remedial secession. So I hope.
Thank you for that, and please give our panelists another round of applause. Hold on, sit down. I'm going to sit down. we're right on time. Conferences like this don't materialize without extraordinary participation from students to board members to members of the Columbia University administration. I want to take an opportunity at this point, closing our conference, to thank some of the individuals and organizations and their sponsorship to organize a conference of this importance. First of all, the Columbia School of Social Work for hosting our conference, its dean, its administrators, and supporters for allowing us this space to congregate today. MISAST, which is the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies here at Columbia University, where our Armenian Studies chair and department is located. The Institute for the Study of Human Rights here at Columbia University, the Institute of Human Nutrition at Columbia University, where Dr. Kimian is closely associated, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Columbia University Armenian Society. You'll see many young faces today. Those students have done an extraordinary job supporting this wonderful conference, and we're grateful. There are 3 or 4 individuals I'd like to single out today. First of all, this wonderful program was prepared by Artsakh, a graduate student in the Department of Slavic Languages. I want to thank him for that hard work in putting that together. Dr. Hakimian is the chair of the Armenian Center here at Columbia University, and we want to extend our deep appreciation to her for our hard work. Dr. Kachik Muradian is here, okay? He's not here, but he's here. He is indefatigable, everyone who knows him. Undergraduate, graduate students, his extraordinary commitment to putting this program together. He can't be here today, but I know he's listening and following very closely. I know we'll have opportunities to thank him afterwards when we get a chance. We want to extend deep appreciation. This conference would not have taken place without Dr. Nicole Vartanian of the School of Social Work. From the very beginning, she had a commitment to understanding the importance of putting on a program, not just for the institutional memory of the people of Artsakh, but the living memory, the importance of understanding a trauma-informed framework to understand the important issues that we're discussing, whether it's individuals or international application of the law. Nicole, we want to thank you for your inspiration, your leadership, and your dedication. Thank you very much. Please, we're going to congregate in the back, and we hope that you can extend some discussions with our speakers. We are very, very grateful for your attendance today. Thank you.